Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our last free webinar of the spring season. It's hard to believe it's already June, in fact, already summer. My name is Meredith Dalt, and I'm a business journalist at Smith School of Business, and I will be your moderator for today's panel discussion. This month, we're going to be talking about what happens when business gets political and how to plan for hot button issues. Today, we'll be diving into the new age of social corporate responsibility, which is also known as CSR. As always, today's webinar is presented by Smith Business Insight and by Queen's Executive Education. And as usual, every month I remind you of this, and I'm doing it again this time. Our hour-long discussion is going to be recorded, so you will automatically be getting a recording of our discussion in your inbox within a couple of days if you registered for today's event. So feel free to do what you want with that recording, share it with your colleagues, whatever. But people who often ask about, is there going to be a recording? Yes, look for it in 2 or 3 days. And I also want you to ask questions. One of the great things about these conversations is that we do have audience participation in the form of asking questions. If you do want to ask a question, and please, we love audience questions, use the Q&A button, not the chat button. The Q&A button at the bottom of your screen is going to get your question into the queue, and we'll get to as many of those questions as we can as we go along. So with no further ado, I'm going to launch today's topic. Then we're going to reintroduce our guests. So here we go. Consumers today are demanding more from companies that they do business with. From the war in Ukraine to Black Lives Matter, more people want to see companies speaking up and taking a side on social and political issues. But when should companies be speaking up, and what are the risks? So to unpack today's questions, I've got 3 quite amazing guests, and we're really grateful to have them with us today. First one, Dr. Jacob Brower is an associate professor and distinguished faculty fellow in marketing and academic co-director of the Master of Digital Product Management program at Smith School of Business. A recognized expert on corporate social responsibility, Brower's work examines the factors that drive corporate social responsibility, or CSP, by firms, and how a firm's history of corporate social performance impacts the payoffs from changes in its current CSP level. Prior to earning his PhD, he worked as a consultant and market research analyst, specializing in brand management and tracking for several Fortune 500 companies, including FedEx, AT&T, and IBM. Jake, it's great to have you with us today. Melody Gaukel is a senior vice president at Proof Strategies. She has more than 20 years of experience providing strategic guidance to clients across multiple sectors. Gaukel's experience covers many facets: strategic planning, media relations, stakeholder campaigns, brand management, and public affairs. She has also coached clients through a variety of issues and crises, including those where business decisions collide with polarizing social issues. She has won numerous awards from the International Association of Business Communicators and the Canadian Public Relations Society. Thanks for being with us today, Melody. And finally, Paul Klein is the CEO of Impakt, a B Corp that helps corporations improve their social impact on the world. And he founded Impakt in 2001. He is a global authority on helping businesses benefit from solving social problems. He's also the founder of the Impact Foundation for Social Change, an organization that creates pathways to employment for vulnerable people. Paul recently authored the new book, Change for Good, an action-oriented approach for businesses to benefit from solving the world's most urgent social problems. It's a pleasure to have you with us today, Paul, as well. So I'm going to ask you all to unmute. Woo, that was a lot. That was more of an intro than I normally have to do. So let's get right to it. So let's start by looking at the topic. Let's get us all on the same page, the topic of corporate social responsibility. So how it's evolved, what's behind today's consumer demands for brands to take on larger social issues. So Jake, I'm going to start with you. I know you've done a lot of work on CSR, and you have been using the term CSR 3.0 to describe CSR and social impact. So can you talk us through how you got to the notion of 3.0 and what it is, and sort of what's CSR 1 and what's CSR 2?
Sure.
Really briefly, so we're all on the same page.
Yeah, and thanks. It's great to be on such a great panel with all of you. I'm excited about today's conversation. So I think the way I view it, and sort of from a historical lens, corporate social responsibility, it's been around for a long time. There's examples all the way back into the 1910s, the 1920s of companies that were treating their employees well, treating their communities well, all of those things. But I think the real organized push for it really started to pick up in like the late 60s, 1970s with what I kind of term CSR 1.0. And primarily that was about philanthropy. That was donating money to your community, donating money to causes, trying to have some sort of positive impact, turn some of those profits into some sort of positive social good in some way. But it was really mostly about dollars, maybe volunteerism, executives volunteering their time. And then sort of that was the way of the world through, I'd say, the 80s into the early 90s. And that's where sort of CSR 2.0 really started to rise. And CSR 2.0 is, I think the simplest way to put it is just sort of getting your house in order. So making sure that you're not causing any harm outside of your business. So looking at, what environmental impacts are we having, what sort of social impacts, what governance related issues exist, and making sure that we're getting our house clean, our products are good, we're treating our employees well, we're not damaging our community, the environment. And really that has been steadily rising. And I think in academia, we call it institutionalized. The simple way to put that is it's table stakes now in a lot of industries. It's grown a lot and become a bit of an expectation through sort of the late 2010, 2012 timeframe. And that's really where we've seen CSR 3.0 take off. And CSR 3.0, I think, is this new expectation that firms are expressing their values and sort of, I hate to say it this way because, the Supreme Court ruled it this way, but like who they are as a person in some ways, what is their sort of values and who are they and why should I interact with your organization is I think what I'd call CSR 3.0. And that's sort of been on the rise over the last 10 years, I would say, but really hot over the last 5 or 6 years. I think it's really risen to the top. And that's really where the action is around CSR these days.
And just so that we're all on the same page, Jake, can you give us some examples of companies who are really kind of reached 3.0?
So there's examples. I think some of probably the most prominent example that we all think of right now is Nike and Colin Kaepernick when Nike took that step forward around sort of the Black Lives Matter space. That was one of the big ones, I think, that really hit the big publicity and started this real conversation around this. I mean, a company that's doing CSR 3.0 really well, I actually look at Ben & Jerry's a lot of the time as a company that's truly committed to their values and has been, whether it's popular or not, and it's not just that they say good things or do good things, it's that they've aligned their organization around these things and make sure their house is in order in a particular category before they start talking about it. And before they start pushing it and advocating for these things, they make sure they've got things right before they go out and do that. So, I mean, Ben & Jerry's is always the one that you can easily put a finger on and say, they practice what they preach. They live up to what they stand for, and you can check their system. And when they're not right, they say, we're not perfect, but here's what we're doing. And I think that transparency is a big piece of that too.
Oh, interesting. Okay. I'm going to get you guys going on a conversation soon, but right now I'm going to let each of you have a little time on the floor before I open it up to all of you, because I know you all have lots to say about this. So Melody, I want to get you going on a little bit of background about your company, Proof Strategies. So I know that you guys do surveys of Canadians. You did a survey called the Can Trust Study. And I know that your survey has findings on Canadians' attitudes towards companies and social issues. Can you explain the kind of stuff that you've found? Give us a little background on what Canadians feel about this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, our most recent survey, we asked the question, how important is it for leaders and companies to speak out on social issues? And it's resounding that Canadians want people to do. They want the organizations to do it. 57% believe that business leaders have an obligation to speak out on issues regularly. So this is not a nice to do anymore. This is now something that your customers and your employees are asking for. And even when we think about employees, they are now trusting their employers more than they're trusting political leaders. The shift in who is building communities is really changing. And so now employees, as an employer, as an organization, you have a responsibility to be part of society. You can't just ignore that your employees aren't out there living and breathing in the world. You now need to be thinking about them and their whole selves. And that has to be part of the conversation. And employees, Canadians generally, are just looking for guidance here. They are looking for people to help them make decisions and inform them of what is good and aligning themselves with that, whether that's for employment, whether that's for a purchasing decision, whether that's for a service decision. That's what you're looking for. And so our study is showing that that's only increasing. It's not decreasing.
Right.
And it's across the board, small business to large business, no question.
And do we have a sense that Canadians feel they're getting that, or they want to see more of it?
It's a good question. I think that that's still up for debate.
Okay.
Or, I don't know that Canadians are seeing it, but they're asking for it.
They're asking for it. Okay, thanks for the clarification.
Yeah.
Paul, I want to come to you now because you've written a book called Change for Good. And in that book, you say that companies simply aren't doing enough when it comes to social responsibility issues. You call most of their efforts CSR light. And I would like to know you spell that light like light beer and not like LIGHT. What is CSR light and what should companies be doing instead?
Well, just building, on what Melody and Jacob said, I think that you've got a context where, on the one hand, as Jacob said, where there's a very high expectation. Corporations ought to be doing something different. There's an expectation that they're doing way more than just checking the box. And, as Melody, said, we have expectations among, consumers and citizens that businesses ought to be doing more. The problem is that CSR light is a very kind of a devious construct that's happened within corporations, where the concept is, and the reality is that most corporations do as little as possible in this space to be seen to be doing as much as possible. And there lies the problem. And so the real leaders in this space, I believe, are corporations who will actually contribute in a meaningful way to solving issues that are important to all of us. And I think the context is also such that, from the pandemic and just in general, I think that most people would say that, their lives are not as good as they were before. And so there's a higher expectation that people are going to be addressing these things, and that those people that actually genuinely do that, walk the talk, will deserve to be rewarded and paid attention to, and the problem is that, again, just building on some of the examples before, like if I ask, like the companies that come to mind for people in terms of those companies that are actually genuinely making a difference in the world, it's always the same companies: Ben & Jerry's, Patagonia, maybe Palm Shoes. After that, you ask people, there starts to be a bit of a silence, because you know what? There's not enough things like that. Why is it that those companies, I love Ben & Jerry's, I love Patagonia, Lego is another fantastic example. There needs to be more.
Right. But what about all those companies who are doing CSR light are clearly kind of getting away with that? And so isn't that it's working for them?
Yeah. Well, maybe someone else. I mean, I'm
but is it?
Yeah.
Like,
Sure. I mean,
I get enough calls from clients or people out there who are saying, I'm in trouble now because I've gone out there and done something and I haven't put my house in order, or I haven't gone far enough. So I think the question is, I don't know how long you can live with CSR light right now, because people can dig in, right? Your ESG reporting, your financials, employees have vocal platforms now. They can literally post anything on their social feeds and suddenly you're a story. So are they getting away with it? I just don't know that we're holding them accountable to it. That might be the bigger question.
Okay, that's fair.
I think there's also a stakeholder question there too, right? I mean, a lot of the CSR light, I mean, as a CSR researcher, I use the data that goes into sort of the social investment indices. And, there's a lot of companies that are checking the boxes to get their CSR scores up to be included in these social investment indices that are growing like crazy right now. And they're extremely popular. But is it the same what investors are looking for in ESG investing versus what the market is looking for? And the reality is, until you make a mistake, until you trip up, most people don't have the time or the energy to dig into everything that every company is doing. But when you screw up, if your house is in order, it's going to come through, and you better be calling Melody. That's really what it comes down to, right? I mean, that's the reality of the situation right now. Is as soon as you mess up and they look at your house and they say, oh, wait a minute, this is a pattern of behavior, right? I mean, if we think about it as the sort of psychology side, if they see a pattern of behavior, or they can't make an attribution about what kind of company you are, and that's some of the research I've done, is your history of behavior significantly affects how the market responds to the things you say you're doing now. And that's exactly it. And as soon as you're under fire, you can get called out on it, and they're going to take apart your house. And if your house is not clean, they're going to find all the skeletons and the dirt and the dust and whatever it is you want to find. They're going to find it. And that's when things turn bad.
Well, here's an example of something that you just said that would be definitely worthy and need of Melody's help and sharing this. Like, you can't make this stuff up, and this is a true story. This is Burger King in Europe came out for Pride Day or Pride Month or whatever. They actually came out with something called the Pride Whopper and marketed this as this Pride Whopper with, quote, 2 equal buns.
Whoa. How did it go over, Paul?
Not too well, not too well. 2 equal buns. And this is the level of thinking or not thinking that generates a huge risk.
Because it's not a marketing initiative, right? Like, doing this is not, you're not doing this for the marketing. If you're doing this for marketing, you're doing it for the wrong reasons. You need to actually understand who you are as an organization, lean into those values, and do it for the right reasons. And when you don't do it for the right reasons, like coming up with 2 equal buns, that's designed to sell Whoppers. That's not designed to push the Pride movement in Europe. Mm-hmm. That's not designed to demonstrate support for the cause. That's designed to sell Whoppers. What does that mean?
So instead, Melody, can you speak to, like, what kinds of issues are companies being asked to take positions on? I mean, some of them will be really familiar to people, but I'm sure you're aware of lots of others.
Well, I mean, yeah, you name it, they're being asked to talk about it, from environmental issues through to geopolitical issues. You know, the war in Ukraine is obviously something that's happening. Judicial decisions, Roe versus Wade, very lively conversation right now. But it's also, you know, all the diversity, racism, inequities. You know, you're starting to see conversations around healthcare inequities, housing inequities. You know, I work with a lot of real estate developers as well. And, you know, the affordable housing movement is huge. And they're asking a lot of, you know, advocates are out there asking really good questions. No one should stop asking those questions. We need to hold organizations accountable, but organizations who are just paying it lip service are going to get called out on it. That's the issue.
Mm-hmm. So what's the advantage for companies in actually speaking up at all? Why don't they just stay quiet and sell shoes and just be done with it?
Well, you know what, this one of the ththings that's happening, and there's a whole bunch of things I think that we're talking about that are all right, all correct rather. You know, so in the context of a highly politicized environment, when you've got a situation like abortion or gun control or whatever else, where companies have possibly half of their employees and customers on each side of the issue. So sometimes what's happening, unfortunately, is people say little or nothing at all, you know, because there's too much risk in leaning into one side or another. Mm-hmm. You know, and so what do? I mean, it's easy for people like us to say, you know, if you're a progressive person, you obviously would take a side, you know, but there's not too many, and people like Ben & Jerry's or Patagonia or sometimes Starbucks has done this, have the courage, their leaders have the courage to actually say, you know, I don't care, we're going to support gay marriage, or we're going to support gun control, or whatever it is. Starbucks, Howard Schultz said that he would prefer people don't bring guns in the stores. Well, that's a pretty edgy thing to say, some places. But there's not, when you think about it, there's not too many companies that have that degree of leadership. But I think there's an opportunity there myself.
Yes, more?
Well, yeah, because, you know what, as it comes back to, I think, what Jacob, you were saying, it's like your values. You have to stand up, like, what is, you know, ultimately that is, you know, the essence of who you are at your company. And if you're a leader and you're, you know, it's the right thing to do to say, okay, well, yeah, maybe there is a possibility that could alienate all kinds of people who don't agree with not bringing the guns in the stores. But what should also do, in addition to ethically being, in my view, the right thing to do, is that it should say on the other side of the aisle that anyone who believes this is the right thing to do, not bringing guns in stores in this case, should be an ally.
Right. Have we, I don't know if you guys have access to this kind of thing, but have we seen examples of companies that did stand up for something and then had it really not work for them, that lost customers, or that they had to dig themselves out of quite a big hole? I don't mean to put you on the spot, but
I was actually going to raise that point, and I think Paul's comment really sort of starts down that path. Is, I think when we're looking at these kinds of issues, there's really two approaches being used by firms. There are proactive and reactive firms, right? There are firms that are responding to the external pressures, and with good reason, right? I mean, I think that's exactly the example that Melody was giving. That, if you're a housing developer, the idea of affordable housing is going to be front and center for you, and you need to react to that. But there are also, I don't see as many big mistakes being made, and Melody can correct me on this one, but I don't see as many reactive mistakes being made as proactive mistakes being made from where I sit. That firms decide, like the example of the Pride Whopper, right? This is a firm trying to sort of get ahead of it and jumping forward and adding something to the conversation where they really just missed the mark. And I think that's the proactive side, is where firms are making some fairly large blunders. For example, around Black Lives Matter, there was I can't remember which organization did it, but it was a study of sort of responses of consumers and the marketplace generally to firms' statements around Black Lives Matter. And by and large, the big companies that came out and, blacked out their social media sites and all those things in support of Black Lives Matter, the ones that got hammered for it were the ones that didn't have their house in order. That, immediately somebody would say, well, wait a minute, you don't have any BIPOC individuals in your executive team, nor do you really in the top third of your organization do you have many BIPOC individuals. What are you doing? And I think that's where a firm decides to go proactive and try to put themselves out there, is where they run into problems. And to me, I think a big piece of this is this progression that I mentioned early on, the 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, is there's a reason that's a progression. And I actually think there's an evolution there that is required. That I think if you skip that part where you get yourself in order and you jump straight into trying to be proactive and try to position your organization based on these kinds of issues, that's where you're going to get yourself in trouble. And I think that's, that it's a number of organizations got in big trouble for coming out with this. And I think the other question that comes out of this, and I know it's later on in the discussion guide, but I want to kind of call it now, is the size of the organization does matter, right? We talk about, you could have up to half of your customers on either side of the issue. And there's actually been some really good recent academic research looking at what are the impacts of that. And what they found is that for small organizations, these kinds of risks are actually potentially worthwhile, because the probability of gaining a few new, if you've only got a 3% market share, that means 97% of the market's out there. So even if you lose half of your current customers, the people you stand to gain could more than make up for the customers you lose. Whereas if you're a 50% market share, your activity is unlikely to gain back. You lose 25% of your, half of your market share. Those efforts are not going to gain you another 25% of customers. It's just not going to happen. So, the size of the company matters a lot, and small firms really do have an advantage here at this moment. And also, I think it's easier to get their house in order. So it's sort of the cyclical problem that it's easier to stick to your values when the values are clearer. And that tends to happen more in smaller, faster, more agile organizations.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Yeah. I actually want to go back to you for a second, Jake. And while you had the floor, I just also want you to touch on the financial payback issues, because I know you've done research in this area. So is there financial payback of leading in CSR, whether you're small or large business? Is it worthwhile? Do we know that?
So historically, what I would say, some of the research that I've done is looked at it and looking at CSR 2.0, the previous generation. But what we were able to demonstrate is that actually the first adopters of CSR 2.0 actually faced more stock market risk and profitability risk, that there was more volatility around that because some of the things that they were going to choose to do were maybe not going to land well. But what we've seen over time is that profitability impact has fallen through about 2008, 2009, to the point that you're not really going to see a large, in aggregate. So this is, some firms can do it, but in aggregate, we're not seeing a big increase in profitability or stock market response to CSR. But what we're seeing is a risk reduction aspect. So It used to be risky when you were trying to differentiate on it, and it's become much lower payoff, but much less risk, and in fact might insulate you from risk. And I think with CSR 3.0, we're going to see a similar pattern. And there's an awful lot of risk associated with CSR 3.0 activities right now, because so many firms are launching the Pride Whopper and things like that, because they're trying to get ahead of this and be proactive and trying to differentiate and position themselves in some way, and some of them are doing it great. And again, unfortunately, Paul's right. We can always point to the same examples. Patagonia is doing it beautifully. Ben & Jerry's is doing it beautifully. But there's some firms that are missing the mark and they're getting punished for it. And I think it's highly volatile right now, who's going to get returns and who's not. And I think from an academic perspective, at least, we don't have a great understanding yet of what are the things that are critical to making sure that you don't get hammered if you try to position on this and differentiate. But I'll also defer to the folks in the practical world, because they're usually ahead of us on these things, and I'll figure it out in 10 years.
Yeah, let Jacob take his breath. Take a breath, Paul and Melody. Did you want to jump in on that?
Well, I think we were chatting about it a little bit earlier, just around what's the role of the board in all of this. And so I've been chatting with boards of directors and having those conversations, and they're recognizing that they need to be part of these conversations and recognize that it's not always about shareholder value, right? That this is, as a board, if they don't set the stage, that it's okay to make an investment, because it does isolate you from risk later on, or it does help you in terms of society to attracting the right talent, or bringing in being able to move the meter forward in your category, which are major considerations for boards right now. The boards and their role have really changed, and that's who's going to ultimately hold senior executives accountable to some of these things that are going through right now.
I agree 100%, and just building on this train of thought, I think in terms of value to a company, the piece that they're missing now, honestly, in my view, is that it is in fact CSR, or being responsible in however way we want to describe it, is actually of very little value. What is of value is corporations like some of the ones that Jacob, that you just mentioned, who are actually moving the needle in some way or another on issues that matter to all of us. So that is social change. So the value now is not in what's going on today, not in this sort of performative CSR light. It is in social change. And the problem, I would say, the other point related to this is that, so if you're a company and you actually want to contribute to social change, the reality is that inside these companies, they know nothing about social change. They don't know about issues. So companies, if you have an IT problem, you find an IT expert. If you have a legal problem, you want the best legal expert. Right. If you have whatever. And so now we have companies that are hopefully beginning to realize that social change is what matters. Guess what you need? Social change expertise. And the real social change experts are people who've lived those problems. And that's why they're called, what we call them, people with lived experience, or increasingly lived experts.
So what would that look like for you? I mean, what would that mean? You're hiring people who've been homeless to be the consultants on homelessness, or what are you imagining?
That's exactly right, actually, honestly. And, so a specific example, when we created Home Depot's it's called the Orange Door program, which focuses on ending youth homelessness. We don't know anything about youth homelessness. We have never experienced that. So what we did was rely on youth who have experienced homelessness to help create that program. The design of that program was based on the input of youth. The colors that were chosen, the design of the program, actually, and Home Depot, Impact is not currently involved with it, with the continuation of it. We created the whole thing. We're involved with for a number of years, but Home Depot, I'll give them great credit. They are still maintaining the direct involvement of youth with lived experience in what they do in this area. And so, it's like, this is not news really at all. In fact, all the literature and experience would say that social problems are best addressed by people who have experience with those problems. So it's really no surprise that businesses aren't actually doing very much in this area, because they don't involve any of the people that know best.
Right. Melody.
No, I was just going to build off of that, which is also why businesses have the potential to actually do things too, because they can invest in finding these people, right? And they can create programs that enable the changes that are required. because they have those reaches. So there's a huge opportunity for businesses at the same time and organizations. So yes, there's a massive deficit right now, but they are actually well positioned to help change it if they actually want to. And it's us as consumers and us as employees holding those people accountable to those changes.
Now, I'm going to be a cynic here. It's possible, maybe I am, I don't know. But I think there are consumers out there who would see the company hiring the homeless guy to be the housing consultant, but the rest of the team is like upper middle class people who live in the suburbs. Does it look a little bit like lip service?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's lip service now. I mean,
right.
Like, I don't know. Like, I think that the best thing that companies can do, and it's not, and there's all kinds of ways of doing this, right? It's not just not hiring someone necessarily. It's involving people, a range of people outside the boardroom in co-creating a company's response to issues that matter.
Got it. Okay.
In whatever, there's lots of different flavors of what that could look like.
For sure.
But if you want to reduce risk, like there's no, in my view, no better strategy than to actually turn the important decisions about how a company is responding to important issues to the people who've actually experienced those issues.
And I think there's something to be said too. You know, we look at organizations who focused on innovation for 20, 30, 40 years, and they've introduced processes. I mean, things like design thinking, some of these kinds of ideas where you're bringing in that external perspective, you're changing the focus and the positioning and just the mindset of the organization to start to bring that external perspective in. But we don't see social responsibility as innovation. And I think that the more it could be classified as innovation, this is innovation, the more it might get some real attention. I mean, and again, you can talk to any designer in an organization, they're going to say, well, we're still seen as sort of the weirdos that are tucked off in a corner of the building a lot of the time. But you know, it's the same kind of thing, is that bringing these folks in, you know, the example you gave before about the Pride Whopper, not to bring that one up again, but, you know, if there was an LGBTQ person who was on the board and they came forward and said, here's what we're going to launch, they just said, I don't think so, right? Like that, it doesn't pass the sniff test, right? Much the same way as these organizations that come out in strong support of Black Lives Matter, but don't have any people of color at the executive level to say, wait a minute, before we do that, here's some things we could think about. And it's unfortunate because I think, you know, Paul, you used the word performative and CSR light, that, you know, there's these companies put in quotas to hire people of color or whatever it is, but they then don't give those people voice or put in programs to retain them and get them promoted up through the organization to get to decision levels. It becomes this thing that you can put on the front page of a newspaper, but it's not or on your annual report, but it's not something that actually leads to better decision making. And it's, you know, we've seen the real benefits of cross-functional teams, and there's tons of research that says that. Why can't we see the same kind of thing around this space? And it's because we don't treat it as innovation. We see it as this sort of risk management. It almost like falls into the sort of legal department in a lot of organizations rather than being sort of at the core of the business. It's something that we're trying to avoid rather than something to use to make the organization stronger with a future looking kind of perspective. So, I mean, until it becomes something that we see as a way forward and not just something we have to deal with all the time, I think we're not going to get the right people in the room to make the right decisions.
Right. So is it a values question, Melody? You've said in the past that companies should really start with their own values and then use those values as a guide when responding to social issues. Like, is that it? Are companies just not even sure what their values are fundamentally? Is that where we're stuck?
I mean, that's part of it. Or, you know, you see things where they do something and it's not in alignment with their values and they get in trouble. You know, that's often, unfortunately, when I get called in, it's the first thing I say is to an organization is, what are your values? What do you believe in? Who are you as an organization? If you say you're inclusive, but then make a decision that excludes someone, that's not in alignment with your value. If you say you're transparent, but then hide the oil spill, that's not transparent, right? So you need to really understand who you are as an organization, because that is going to attract the people who believe in those values, who then want to make the change, right? You're going to attract the types of customers that see those values coming to life. And then that becomes your guidepost. So when you make a misstep, and we will, this will not be a perfect thing. We're going to make mistakes, but the values are there to help guide you and provide you with that framework to ask you that question of yourself. And then it does trickle down to the organization, hopefully, if you're actually living those values, right? So that people can, I am attracting the right talent to the boardroom table. I am going to make the right decision when someone asks me to do something that feels icky, it doesn't pass the smell test, right? I had this organization with an organization the other day. They came to me, they had a situation, and I literally recited their values back to them. And they went, "Oh my God, you're right." And I said, "I'm not right. Your values are right. This is what your values are telling you to do." And suddenly their response to the issue completely changed. The issue went away, right? Because that's who they are as an organization. Their staff believed in the decision. Their customers believed in the decision. Their external stakeholders believed in the decision because that's who they are. And when you ignore that, that's when you run into problems. And it doesn't need to be a big company, right? Small organizations can have really simple values. And I know I was chatting with someone the other day about, there's a convenience store near my house, Old School General. It is the most values-driven convenience store I've ever seen. They ripped up their parking lot, put in a community garden. They host community justice programs with all the local schools. Everyone in the neighborhood knows what that convenience store stands for. Do you know which convenience store had the lineup when we were in lockdowns? Old School General. Right. The other convenience stores all went out of business. But we all supported that one because we knew exactly what it stood for.
Oh, amazing. Is that in Toronto?
Toronto, yeah.
Yeah, fascinating.
Hey,
Paul.
Meredith, I have a question for my colleagues here. It's something I discovered recently. I'm trying to think about it myself. It seems it was really a confusing thing when I found out about it. But this is a good example. Like, so one of the things is lots of companies, of course, do good and bad things at the same time, or things that are, good and not so good. But I actually discovered that, the gun manufacturer, I think it's called Smith and Wesson, a huge manufacturer. I think that they maybe are the ones who manufactured that weapon that was used in the horrible tragedy in Texas recently. Anyway, this company has, I am not making this up, someone who is responsible for corporate social responsibility.
So one person, that's their job.
Yeah, in a
living the values.
Yeah, in a company that makes weapons.
Right. So
what are your thoughts?
You're asking the panel. Panel?
Yeah, I am.
Well, I think it's a great question, and it's I don't have answers yet, and even when the research is done, I probably won't have answers. I'll have some evidence, but we're actually, a colleague and I are digging into a question of, when a firm appoints like a chief sustainability officer, what is the impact on that firm's actual sustainability record? What happens to their CSR record? And so drawing an analogy for some other work that I did looking at like a chief marketing officer, if you bring in a chief marketing officer, they by themselves, we found actually can't make much of an impact. Nor the other side of that is if a top management team, the sort of executive suite, has a lot of marketing experience, does that make them more market oriented? That's a tongue twister to say that all the time. And what we found is that actually didn't drive market orientation either. What we found is if you put a chief marketing officer in an executive board with marketing experience and marketing background, we called it this sort of seed and soil analogy, that you plant the seed in fertile soil and you can see these things take off. And our theory is that that's going to be true of sustainability as well. So in organizations where they appoint a sustainability officer, but that person has either no power, either legitimate power that they're granted some power to make some decisions, or some sort of informal power that allows them to have an influence in the boardroom, that they're just window dressing, right? That it's a performative movement to say, look, we have a sustainability officer, we check that box on our annual report, our sustainability reports, and we're done with that. Versus an organization that truly is trying to do this, there's going to be the ability to plant that seed in fertile soil, that organization is ready for it. And my suspicion would be in the Smith & Wesson case, yes, they've got a sustainability officer, but I'm guessing that's not terribly fertile soil.
And it's not that, yeah, it's a great analogy, Jake. I kind of think about it and I kind of go, well, every organization has the right to have values, right? So Smith & Wesson probably has a set of values of who they are as an organization, and they need someone to bring that to life. Their product maybe is part of the conundrum, right? Are they credible in the conversations they're trying to engage with? Might be where there's a disconnect, and I don't know enough about what Smith & Wesson stands for, but presumably there's something that it stands for. There's a purpose behind why it exists as an organization. And so that person is responsible for pulling it together. Whether we believe in it or not is a different question. And are they credible in the conversation, I think, is the other part of the conversation. So it's an interesting one. I hadn't heard of that. I now need to dig into it because I feel
I feel like for people like us in this space, I mean, this really comes up a lot, you know. Like we've at Impact, we've done work for a lot of companies that other people think that we shouldn't be working for, you know, oil and gas companies,
right,
companies, and others. So there's, you know, in the social change community, there's a lot of polarization itself, you know.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I work with a mining company as well, and you know, it's a big debate. But at the end of the day, we need minerals. You know, we all have a cell phone, we all have a computer. Critical minerals are not going to go away. We can't go to electrification if we don't have critical minerals. So then you have to make decisions around, you know, is it the right? What are they doing as an organization? Or are they living their values? If your value is to pillage the earth, that's maybe not a value I personally align with, but maybe works for them. But if the value is more around our job is to extract what we need and leave it better than we found it, maybe that's something I can get behind and I can understand where they're going with that.
As Nadine Delisle, one of our audience members, just wrote in, the values of the gun manufacturer probably includes valuing the right to have guns. So there you go.
Yeah.
I want to use this as a segue to get to some of our audience questions because we have lots and really interesting ones. I feel this is going to be one of these discussions that could go on for hours. We had touched on the topic of marketing and the role, you know, this isn't marketing, and yet it sort of has a role to play. The question is, I see marketing and potential sales around what I would call very controversial subject matter, and it actually changes my belief in the company itself because it's different than my core beliefs. Can these companies take the wrong direction and try to appeal to a small group beliefs and then hurt themselves in the process?
I mean, I think the evidence says yes at this point. Like, I think that, you know, there's not a lot of research right now, I would say. So speaking as an academic, there's not a lot of research right now because it's such a new thing and academics are really slow and the publication process is slow. So the evidence is limited. But what we're finding is that the alienation effect can be quite large, particularly for larger organizations. But I still think it comes back kind of to what Melody was saying. You know, if the company is very clear about their values and they articulate those values and they behave consistently with those values, then to me, I consider all of that to fall under the realm of marketing. So before, when we had the comment about marketing with the thing, I think of that as the advertising versus the marketing, which the marketing is really making sure we have a product that appeals to the group of people we're trying to appeal to. So, you know, if that is truly your organization's values, you know, the gun control example that we had before, you know, I could choose not to go to that organization if their values don't align with mine. I mean, the thing like Hobby Lobby and some of those other things that we've seen over time, or Chick-fil-A in the United States, that, you know, have come out with very clear statements of indications of what their values are. If they continue to behave with respect to those values, they are going to lose some customers that don't agree with those values. I mean, that is the risk. The other side, though, is there's evidence that if you don't stand for anything, that people are also going to leave because people are starting to expect that their consumption and the organizations with whom they interact are going to share some level of values with them. And that's not every product category, that's more than others. But I think there is very much people want to know what are the values of the organization that I'm working with, at least some people, not all customers. And if people are consistent with their values and they respond to things consistent with their values, then the people they're alienating are the people that they've effectively chosen not to serve.
Right.
Another great, the Ben and Jerry's is another great, like, I don't know if people, this is from last year, Ben and Jerry's took a stand that they did not want their ice cream to be sold in the occupied territories. You know, alienated in Israel, and that alienated a whole lot of people there, Jewish people, who were calling Ben and Jerry's anti-Semitic, even though they're in fact Jewish. So, and they probably, I don't know, I mean, perhaps they lost customers within that group because of that.
I'm going to jump in here because we've got lots of questions. Audience, I'm going to ask you to just put those questions in the Q&A box, not the chat window, please. Can I just we've got so many great things here, including people who've been giving us, who are looking up on the Smith & Wesson website to get their actual values. So we have those now. If we have time, we'll get to them at the end. The question is, why are consumers expecting this? Let's face it, companies are interested in maximizing profits and shareholder wealth. Is this just another way for consumers to feel good about themselves for consuming goods?
That's a great question.
Okay, question.
All right. I mean, I got my Patagonia hoodie. Now I'm saying to the world, look at my values. I got my Patagonia. Like, what is the ultimate? What is it ultimately? What's in it for consumers, really?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I feel like it comes back to a values alignment. That we as people will, I think, tend to gravitate towards companies and brands that seem to share our values. So just like some of the other more hot button issues we talked about before, like for some people, those companies that do things that I don't agree with, or support issues that I don't agree with, that aligns with them, and I guess that's great, But I think that I think it's at that level, like I feel like consumers mostly don't know the details behind what companies are doing. It's a sort of superficial awareness of a company that feels like they're leaning into things that matter to me. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, because those things have also evolved and changed over the last couple of years. We went through this thing called a pandemic. We're still kind of going through it. You could also call it the Great Reset in life, right? It changed a lot of people. The number of people that I've talked to in the last year who have quit a job because they no longer believed in that organization, and they didn't, right? That says a lot. And so that has a ripple down effect. If you have an organization where everyone decides to leave because they don't believe in that organization, what happens to that organization? When those people go, they start to seek out and look at things differently. So I can't explain why we're demanding it per se, because I do think that more and more Canadians are looking, and more people in North America are looking to organizations for this. But I do think that we're going through a significant shift in who we are as people after the last couple of years. And so I think that's why there's just a bigger scrutiny and more questions being asked. And asking questions isn't wrong. We should be asking questions.
Right.
I just to raise one piece just sort of tied to that idea though, and that I want to just, I always put this out there at the end of these conversations and it freaks people out, but we have enough time to make up for it here by saying something positive in a minute. But I do actually have a serious concern though, from an ethical perspective about what we're seeing in terms of it's one more domain of life in which polarization is going to be clearly visible by the brands that we choose to consume, right? Yeah. So, politics has become polarized, and now all of a sudden our consumption could become much more polarized, and even our choice of employer could become much more polarized. On the one hand, that sort of replicates the echo bubble, the echo chamber that we're building around some of these issues. And now if I only consume the brands that I can clearly signal to others, and I only work for organizations that signal the same values, that echo chamber effect could be enhanced and possibly made worse. So, I mean, I do have some concerns as a marketer, as a business person, as a member of society, that if more facets of our life become infiltrated with polarization, that we're running into the potential for everything about our lives to put us into us versus them mentality. And I think that's a dangerous thing right now. I think we don't need more of that at the moment. So I constantly have this sort of ethical conundrum in my head. I like that this is happening, that people are stepping forward and making a statement on some of these things that need to change, right? The BLM stuff, the LGBTQ stuff, that all of these things need to change in society. We have issues, and that's my voice as a progressively minded person. Others may not agree with that perspective, but the more we polarize on everything, the less the conversation can happen to try to move us in a good direction. So I do have real concerns about this additional facet of life moving in that direction.
So can I take that as an opportunity to ask you about a question that's coming from the audience, asking if you, the panel, could discuss Disney and Florida. Disney having taken a position on standing up for LGBTQIA+ rights in a state that has implemented laws that do not support these communities. I mean, Disney is a pretty beloved company by a lot of people all over the place on all sides of the sides of the political divide, right? So do you think that a company like Disney, massive company like that, taking a stand on that, I believe that's related to the We Say Gay stuff. Anyone want to speak to that? That's a question that's a request of the audience that you speak to this if you could.
Boy, coming at that from a business perspective, I mean, the question, so I'll just put on my business hat now and stay away from the ethical side of it just for a moment, because I don't know the answer to that from that side at the moment, or even have a thought really. But, you know, from the business side, it seems to me that Disney likely did their math and they said, you know, what is the potential upside risk of this and the downside risk? I mean, they're a smart company. I mean, they've made missteps in the past, but every company has. I think that there is some calculus amongst these companies that start to make take these steps, that they say this matters more to our group of stakeholders than it's going to alienate a portion of our population. And we see this with, you know, like Nike, that was part of their calculus, and I don't know if they've openly said it, but it definitely stands that, you know, the people who were out burning their Nikes after the Colin Kaepernick thing weren't necessarily people who were buying new Nikes. A lot of those, you know, there's stories in the media of people went to like thrift stores and bought Nikes just to burn them on video so they could show themselves burning it, but they weren't really Nike customers to begin with. I mean, when Subaru started positioning their product for the LGBTQ community back in the 90s, they got threats of boycotts against them as well. But when they actually did the research, they found out those people the people threatening to boycott weren't even living in areas where they could buy a Subaru at that time. It was sold in limited parts of the United States, nor would they ever have bought a Subaru in the first place. So, I mean, the question is, there's going to be noise. Any of these things, because it's so polarized, there's going to be a lot of noise around it. The question is, again, go back to what Melody was saying about values. Does this align with the pure values of who Disney is as an organization, who they want to be at first? And the second is, I suspect they've done their math and they're anticipating that the negative effect is probably much smaller than the positive effect of being inclusive. But I'll open that to the rest of you, because that's a tough one.
Yeah. Anyone else want to weigh in?
Yeah. I don't know if there's an easy answer to that. I mean, I think that, you know, the reality is at the most basic fundamental level, you know, responsibility and ethical responsibility, not ethical, but responsibility is legal responsibility to do the right thing, to follow the law, right? I mean, that's the kind of really the baseline, and the unfortunately, the law is changing in a lot of places to be much less progressive than it was. So following the law and I don't know the details of the Florida situation, but following the law increasingly could, like, what do you do? Like, if following the law is against your values, what's the answer? I don't know.
That is the conundrum right now. That's what a lot of companies are going to be facing. And it's not going to decrease. They're tough conversations that are going to start happening more and more. I don't know Disney in depth, but I would agree with Jake. There was calculations there around that. But I do think they went back to who they are as an organization. Right. And, you know, so then and part of that calculation would have been the legal risk. If we
So related, actually, can I keep the focus on you, Melody? So someone asks, can the panel speak to the dynamics when a company becomes the target of advocacy groups as a way of raising profile of an issue? So is, for example, the targeting of a company as a tactic to get media coverage, et cetera. How does a company navigate that dynamic? And maybe the Disney situation is one where we'll see that happening, or maybe, I don't know. Anyway, can you speak to that for this audience member?
Well, I mean, I've spent my last 3 weeks doing that.
Right.
Because everyone has a platform now. So everyone wants, and because of that echo chamber that is happening, where, you know, you speak to your friends and family and you all have the same beliefs. And so you've decided that I want to be a voice in that conversation. And so you find a company that you want to pick a fight with, or raise a profile point with. And you have to, and you as an organization, again, have to step back to who you are as an organization and look at, are these people just talking to themselves? Is there actually something happening here that we need to pay attention to? Maybe they have a point, but maybe they don't. And so it is taking that step back to understand, go back to who you are as an organization, really understand what the perspective is, and then do some deep diving. Is this just 10 people talking to themselves? Or
Yeah.
is it actually a movement that we need to pay attention to and might have a long-term impact on our organization? And so that's where you see organizations who overreact because it was really just 10 people talking to themselves and they weren't our customers to begin with.
Right.
Or is there actually a movement happening?
Well, I do want to note on the Disney issue, we've had a couple of people drop into the chat box that as well, Disney may be having this focus on LGBTQ issues given, and even though they operate in Texas, but they have abysmal records when it comes to Indigenous and Black content and Indigenous peoples. And so, so that's an interesting discussion too, right? They may be catering to one group, but completely dismissing some other groups in the process. So, finding that balance, I guess, must be tricky.
But it goes back to get your house in order. Get your house in order.
Know what your values are.
Right? Like you can't, if you're gonna pick that, but you've ignored these 4 other groups, that's on you.
Yeah.
Like get your house in order.
Well, I would also say, Melody, building on what you were saying before, and I think the opportunity is for companies to start thinking differently about people who would traditionally be their adversaries, So the better strategy is always to engage people, is always to say, okay, who are the folks that, really have a problem with what we're doing? Let's bring them in here. And, I have to say that Walmart, this is now years ago, did something I think it was just a genius idea and just really responsible. One of the organizations that was most critical of them is an organization in the US called Environmental Defense. And when Walmart was starting to itself, rethink sustainability, and they've done some, of course, remarkable things in that space, they actually created an office in their operation in Bentonville for environmental defense. They said, you know what, you're welcome to be with us right here, see what's going on, So more of that. So there's a lot to be learned from that.
That's a really good point.
We are so close to out of time and we have so many good questions. And I want to particularly mention this one, Tim Teesdorf. And Tim, I'm sorry, you've written us an excellent quote, which I don't have time to read, but here's the question. And I think it's a good one to end on right now. Why do we want to rely so much on corporate volunteerism and their managers and owners' goodwill? And why don't we push governments much more to take decisive pro-stakeholder action if we really want societal problems to be solved?
I mean, I think part of the question that we raised before, and I think Melody really brought it up, is I hate to say this, but I think a large portion of our population has given up on government as a source of a solution to problems. I mean, I think the reality is I think corporations have demonstrated over the course of the past, many years, but really over the past 20 or so years at least, that they've got much more clout. They've got almost infinite resources when you look at some of the really big corporations that are out there today. And, a lot of these groups, I mean, you look at LGBTQ, you look at Indigenous people, you look at people of color, have been banging their heads into the wall, trying to get change to happen at the government level for so long. And, look at the United States on gun rights and all of the other things. There's been a lot of people who feel like they've been smashing their heads into the wall, trying to get something to happen, and nothing has moved, and it's become politicized. Even when the broader belief of the society is 95% in favor of something, it still becomes politicized and becomes a stalemate in the government. People are saying, okay, well, what else can we do? And I think that at this moment, there are lots of corporations out there that are getting hit with these demands now because they actually see that as a potential for these organizations could move the needle more than all of the lobbying work and all of the trying to use the political system to make these things move. I mean, I agree. Ideally, that's what our political system would be focused on, is the things that are most defective in our society and trying to correct the things that the market isn't fixing. But in this case, the government is, I hate to say, and this is maybe my own personal opinion, but doing worse than the market economy is in a lot of these dimensions. And, why not turn the market economy and try to get corporations on board and try to push them to express their values and make these things move? I mean, I think that's really what it comes down to, is that maybe Melody can tell us, is there any trust in the government metric at this point versus trust in organizations?
Oh gosh, no. The trust is just sinking like crazy, right? Like I've seen the trust in the prime minister, as the example. Sorry, I actually have to look at my notes, has gone from 46% to 36% in 7 years.
Wait, you cut out from 46% to what?
To 33% in 7 years.
Wow.
Well, as Arthur Harris just chimed in here on the chat, corps are in it for more than 4 years at a time.
Well, that's it. I think you're seeing politicians focus on getting elected, not creating conclusive societies.
Right. Guess what, everybody? We're out of time. Paul, I need some final thoughts from you. I always like to leave our audience with a couple of warm, fuzzy, hopeful thoughts, especially if anyone working in our space is is working in the CSR space. Can we give like 20 seconds each on sort of a final thought? Anything you want to say to wrap things up?
Who's Melody?
Paul?
I don't know.
I have nothing hopeful to say.
I don't know. For me, like, I hope that everyone here, like, I think that we've been quite critical in a lot of ways of what businesses are doing. But I think that my own belief is there's never been a better opportunity for corporations to actually do the right thing, live up to their values, walk the talk, involve people with lived experience, and contribute to real social change in a way that actually is helpful to them as well. So you have to think about it in that way. Change has to happen, but there's never been a time when it's actually more possible.
Okay, fantastic. That's very helpful. Thank you. Melody, Jake?
Melody, go ahead.
I was going to say, Paul just nailed it. We are actually at a really interesting point in history. Change is never going to be as slow as it is right now. So imagine what is possible as we move forward. And so for organizations and for us as individuals, like, there's a lot of hope here as well, right? We can make change, we can make a difference, we can support organizations that are doing great things, and we can hold each other accountable, and that's okay. And we should.
Excellent. Jake, final thought?
I think my final thought would be, as long as you've got your house in order, echoing what Paul and Melody both said, I think, this is the moment right now where firms can actually take some chances. But I think the key is we're past the performative stage. Firms are getting nailed on being performative, which is good. But I think we're still early enough in sort of what we call institutionalization, but the sort of, it's not table stakes yet. And I think that we're still in a moment, just like we were with CSR in the 90s, that a firm can actually come out and say, here's what we're doing to try to be better. And that I think they'll actually get some credit for that, for the telling us what their process is, where they're going, and how they're going to try to transform. And I think that transparency is still valued. And we're early enough in this that being true to values and being true to what you're saying and just transparent can actually make a major impact, rather than coming out and doing something really stupid, but just saying, here's what we're doing to try to make our impact on this problem better.
Okay, I feel better already. Thanks, everyone. Now's when I have to just wrap things up for our audience. I know we've gone over by a couple of minutes. Thank you, audience, for being so patient. As I always do at the end of our webinar discussions, I always want to let the audience know about some upcoming opportunities to learn through Queen's Executive Education. So today I'm going to tell you about a session called Communicating with Impact. Talk about saying the right thing at the right time. This is a program coming up this fall designed to equip people with the knowledge and skills to confidently share their insights, analysis, and recommendations with diverse audiences, both inside and outside of their organization. So if you have things to share as a CSR leader, this is maybe a good program for you. You'll learn about delivering informative and motivating presentations, about the role of voice and body language when you're delivering a message, and about how to craft a presentation so that it meets the needs of your audience. You could attend online in October or in person in Toronto this December. For more information, you can visit smithqueens.com/exec ed. And that's it for the season. That was our last webinar of the spring season, which is remarkable. We will be back in September with a new season of webinars. I know that people were really, really grateful to all of you for this conversation. In fact, people said things like, this is one of the best panel discussions I have ever heard. So thank you to our audience for being so generous. And thank you to all of you, Jake, Melody, and Paul, for being such fantastic and insightful guests. We're very grateful you were able to share your insights with us today. So without further ado, I will say goodbye, a happy summer to everybody, and enjoy the rest of the day. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.